and heads the research program on assessment and future learning. He also serves as a research fellow at the Oxford Center of Educational Assessment. His work focuses on addressing the challenges of equity and equality in education. His area of research includes enhancing the use of classroom and large-scale assessments to improve learning for all, monitoring and evaluation of education systems, programs and projects, learner rights, learner voice, and learning across schools in different poverty quantiles, application of item response theory for enhancing the reporting and use of assessment results. His work also includes the developing models of teacher professional development to address equity gaps in schools. Currently, he is supporting the Department of Basic Education, and teacher unions to scale up the National Assessment for Learning, pedagogical strategy in schools, and also enhance the use of teams and systematic evaluation of results to improve policy and practice. So in short, that is the brief introduction of the speaker for today, with Professor Anli Kanje. Right, Professor, I think Professor Anli Kanje is already online. He's going to present online. I'm handing over to you, Prof, so that you can take us through today's plenary session. Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you, Chair. And good morning, colleagues. Just can somebody confirm if you can hear me?
Colleagues, can you confirm if you can hear Prof?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Prof, I can hear you, but our audience here and delegates, they cannot hear you.
Okay, so I'm not sure why. Is there a speaker on your side?
Yeah, our technicians are working on that, Prof. I think very soon they'll be able to hear what you are saying.
Okay, so just let me know when I can start. I'm happy to wait.
Thank you, Prof.
to make a presentation. I do need to first start off by thanking the organizers for this invitation, and secondly, also apologizing that I could not be there in person. And I hope that this presentation will make up for it. I have submitted the paper, and I do hope that you'll have access to it. The topic that I'm looking at today and that I'm going to focus on is it's on entrenching and disrupting performativity regimes, the impact on learning, in brackets, mathematics in post-apartheid South Africa, and it's drawn from the theme of the conference that you're also familiar with. So let me start off by making a couple of introductory remarks and then just showing you the core of the presentation. Let's see, let's see, can you, okay, good. So the overview of the presentation is listed in front of you, and I'm making four key points. One is I'm looking at the critical challenges and the key arguments. Two, I will update some of the current initiatives, highlighting on the DB initiatives. Three, I'll focus on issues of assessment and the reporting. And the fourth one, I'll make an argument about the way forward. The first critical point I want to make is that the challenges, proposal, and options that impact mathematics are also related to other subject areas. And therefore, in this context, any solution that we have that impacts mathematics and this particular group of people we have with us must be integrated within a systems-wide approach. And that the, the point of departure is that mathematics is part of this integrated approach. One cannot have improved teaching and learning in mathematics in isolation of any of the other subjects that we are working with or across the various grades. And hence, the focus of the presentation will be more generic and highlight key mathematical issues, but please bear in mind that it does impact on your practice across the subjects. Now, the one point I think I also want to highlight, and maybe I'll just put my camera off, is that what are the critical challenges? And I want to argue there's two critical challenges that we have not addressed since 1994. The one is the poor quality, which in this case, we're talking about limited learning and limited learning improvement. And second is the issues of equity. And in particular, I want to argue the impact of this learning outcomes that we have is the greatest on poor and marginal communities. And such practices have been with us since 1994. And the graph that you see shows, for example, one of the differential impacts on learner performance across the systemic evaluations, where language differences has a huge impact, a massive impact on what people learn and how they learn. And its issues I'll come back to in a second. Now, colleagues, I want to highlight six key trends and tensions within the system, and that impacts us as teachers, as researchers, as scholars, as academics. Four of these talk to what I'm arguing performativity or results-based accountability systems. And two are some of the challenges and tensions that we have within our system that are providing alternative practices to address some of the problems that we have in. So the first point I want to note is that our current systems that we have, in particular within the context of assessment, are highly derived and impacted on prevailing colonial and apartheid era systems. So we have, for example, tests and exams, including the matric exams, that have been with us since almost for 150 years. And the form and format of these systems and this assessment and testing and examinations approach that so dominate our practice has been with us for literally the entire period since the colonial times. The second point I want to argue, and I will provide evidence for some of these things, is that the policy changes that we've had since 1994 are very explicit on the focus on assessment, the focus on using assessment for improving learning. But it's practice that is promoted within these systems are measurement driven. The practice focuses on testing and assessments that looks at scores rather than learning. And this continues to impact our children, our teaching, our learning, and to some extent, even the research. The third point I want to argue is that there are multiple overlapping accountability systems that impact on how teaching and learning occurs, including mathematics. The fourth point I want to argue is that there's an overemphasis on mathematics and languages, and it might be something that this forum might want to challenge, and I'll highlight its impact in the sense that the emphasis on mathematics and languages further promotes a system where to test aspects of learning and performance functioning that is easily measurable, which in this case is maths, and often at the disadvantage of other subjects. And I'll talk about the tensions and challenges after I address these four issues. So what then do I mean by performativity or results-based accountability systems? Let me be clear, colleagues, that I'm not saying accountability is not important. And I'm not saying teachers, school principals, academics, students, learners should not be held accountable. But what I am saying is that our current accountability systems are dominated by what I would call performativity or results-based. And by this, I mean systems that monitor and evaluate functioning based on numbers. And the practical consequence of this is that it foregrounds performance over learning. And hence you find within the schooling system that the emphasis is on test results, the emphasis is on curriculum coverage, the emphasis is on numbers that participate in workshops, the emphasis is on number of documents that submitted or the number of schedules that you've completed. And all of this is at the expense of real learning. And I'm going to, and I'll show some evidence of how this impacts practice. So this, for example, colleagues, is some of the ways in which this system manifests itself. So for example, in our national development plans, one of the key targets specified is 90% by 2030, 90% of our learners in grade 3, 6, and 9 should have achieved scores of 50% or more. The issue of matric results, for example, the issue of curriculum coverage are all different ways in which accountability of results on performance manifests in the system. If you look at the slide on the picture on my right, you'll see that we have a system that foregrounds performance over learning. And in this case, I did put the annual national assessments, which obviously has been stopped. It's no longer in place. But what's missing in the current system is the emphasis on support. And that has significant negative implications on teaching and learning, and especially in schools that support learners from poor and marginalized communities. So for example, this is where we have an emphasis where schools and teachers are required to have very clear summative assessments and results, number of tests, number of exams, number of assignments, projects, etc., all of which are marked and needs to be submitted. We also have what I would argue a very problematic issue of reporting results, which is in these 7 levels of learning. And the problem, if you look at it quite clearly, is that none of these levels tells you what the child knows and can do, And more important, what should that child or the child's parent or the child's teacher actually do to assist the child to improve learning? And the third really critical issue is that if we look at the targets that are set, and the focus is there's a very limited emphasis on equity and social justice. And I want to argue that what we should have is, instead of having schools that have higher pass rates, we need to have targets that argue how many learners have you assisted and to what extent have you improved their learning. And I'll give some examples of that as we move forward. This is another example of the number of large-scale tests that we have done in the country since '94. And if you look at it, it's over 120 of these large-scale tests that includes TIMS, systemic, NAs, the Western Cape systemic, provincial assessments, etc. And all of this talk to the focus on measuring, on getting results, with the key issue is that limited use is made of these results to improve learning. And the last point there is that all of this comes at significant cost, literally in the hundreds of millions if you look at it over time, and money that could have been spent on invested in learning. So how then do these, the last point about these assessments that I needed to make is the overwhelming majority of them, in fact, over 99% of these, over 90% of these focus on mathematics and they focus on languages. And it is and obviously TIMS focus on science. And it is promoting an assumption that if I do well in languages, if I do well in maths, then I'm performing well. But more critical, it's promoting messages that it's only maths and languages that count, often at the expense of other subjects, or learning and teaching and investing in other subjects, which, as we know, it's quite problematic in the new dispensation, where social issues are quite prominent in the sense of being good citizenship, in the sense of promoting democracy, in the sense of promoting social values, etc. So, how then, and what are the tensions and challenges that have occurred, and to what extent have these manifested in the system? I want to highlight two. One is that the department has adopted the assessment for learning pedagogical strategy, and number two is to list the number of challenges that role players have impacted on the system. So we have, for example, several, and I'm not going to talk much of it, but the decolonized education movement was very instrumental in questioning some of the very Eurocentric approaches, in supporting the ministry to review some of the policies, to the extent that the current curriculum strengthening policy is looking at this issue. It was instrumental in support. The role of teacher unions, for example, have also now moved towards professional development and are quite strong in trying to support teachers to improve teaching and learning. The initial teacher education programs, for example, that are focusing on preparing student teachers to address this issue. So let me then highlight some of the initiatives that the DBE has implemented. And I'm not going to spend much time on this because I want to give one or two examples of what can be done in practice. So here's another example of the new GEC, for example. And a really critical innovation of the GEC is that, one, it's for supporting learners for decision making so that they could move into academic, vocational, or technical tracks. And it involves assessment beyond maths and languages. So it's all the subjects learners will be assessed, and it focuses on non-cognitive assessments, on aptitude, or what they call career inclinations or general capabilities that reflect broader 21st century skills. And so this is a significant move forward. And most important, the results of this assessment, I mean, the certificate that will be done is going to, it's not going to be involve percentages. There's no scores. It's going to be looking at performance levels, which I'll show in a minute. Chair, will you tell me when I have like 10 minutes, please? Are you still hearing me, right, Chair? Hello? 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 Colleagues, can you hear me? Hello?
You are audible.
Okay. So I'm so sorry. Okay, so let me then continue to say that there's, as I say, these are a number of the initiatives that are in place, and I'm not going to spend time. The paper talks a lot about this, and there's a lot of information on this already in the paper. So let me just focus on one or two things, what action we can take and moving forward. In presenting a plan for action, I am not looking at specific points or prescriptions. What I have done instead is to propose principles for actions, given that any intervention, any implementation of change is highly complex, number one. It's highly contextualized, so we must take into account. And so I've identified 6 principles. One is I call no tatama chance. And by that, I mean education policy, education change, education transformation is not a lottery. It needs careful planning, preparation, piloting, monitoring, and evaluation. And it shouldn't be rushed, and we can reflect on our experiences with the curriculum 2005, for example. Number 2, the principle of walking the same road, which is arguing for common understanding and purpose in whatever we undertake and whatever initiative we do. And it's arguing for that, 1, we need to walk on the same road. 2, we need to walk in the same direction, but recognize that we can progress at different paces. The third principle is what I call asina discipline. And essentially, I'm arguing it's an evidence-based decision-making. And the discipline principle there is that just because one day we walk in and we happen to find a panado or a discipline, now we're standing with the discipline in our hand, and we don't know what to do with it, so we go and look for a headache. That is not how
can
policy...
you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Your slides are no longer showing.
Yes, I am showing 4. I'm discussing these 6 principles in front of us.
Can you share
Can
the
you see this
again?
Oh, you can't see it?
Yes.
Whoa.
Yes.
Why? Sorry. So let me get back to presentation mode and window and okay, share. Are we there?
Perfect. Just put them in slideshow.
Yes. Okay. Are we there?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So I was discussing those 6 principles, and the Asina discipline principle is essentially, I'm saying, just because we have a headache, a panado in our hand, does not mean we must look for a headache. It should be the other way around. We need to look at what is the problem that we have. Is it a headache? Is it muscle pain? Is it a bleeding? And then look for a solution. So it's arguing for an evidence-based decision making. The 4th principle I'm arguing is the each one, teach one principle. And drawing from the struggles of the 70s and the student movements of the 70s, it's essentially calling for new modes of collaboration and support, and for recognizing the critical role our students play. And in fact, in the new age of technology and AI, there's an argument that we need to start learning from our students. Yes, we can teach them, but we also need to start learning. The 4th principle I'm arguing for is jump into the pool. And the underlying approach of the principle is that one cannot learn how to swim by Googling swimming. You can't learn how to swim by reading about it. You can't learn how to swim by watching videos and YouTube. You need to get into the pool. And it's arguing that if we want to have effective professional development, if us as lecturers, for example, as us as subject advisors, as us as senior trainers, we need to make sure that we are very familiar with it, and we need to go back into the classrooms. And in particular, we need the subject advisors and policymakers to understand the classroom context in order for them to support teachers. And the last principle I'm arguing is that reporting as recipes. And that's a principle where we produce reports, whether to our students as lecturers, whether to our learners as teachers. Those reports must be promoting actionable next steps. When I read that report you give me, I must know that, oh, this is interesting. This is what ma'am said, or this is what my lecturer said. Now, what do I do next? So with those 6 principles, colleagues, I'm going to highlight 1 or 2 only. The rest are in the paper and in the presentation. So let me skip the first one about evidence-based policy. Let me talk about the walking on the same road. I think the walking on the same road principle is arguing for the value of assessment, and we all know that. And I'm demonstrating that by the value of assessment must start off with the beginning of the lesson, where you make clear not only the lesson objectives, but what evidence do you as a child, as a student, as a learner need to demonstrate that you've benefited from the lesson or from this session. So let's take this very session I'm presenting. You need to do 4 things. You need to, at the end of the session, you need to explain the purpose of assessment. You must discuss its importance in the teaching process. You must distinguish between formative and summative. And you must give examples of how summative can be used formatively. Can you see? I hope people appreciate it's taking the shift away from learning with teacher-centered to a learner-centered, because this is what the learner needs to demonstrate. And this is what the teacher needs to support the learner to do. So keep these 4 in mind, because at the end of it, you must decide, was this presentation a waste of time or did you benefit? And how are you going to know you benefited? These are the 4 criteria you use. Okay, so what's the purpose of assessment? It's to gather evidence of what learners know, understand, and can do. Okay? And the point is, effective use of assessment must address the learning needs of all our children. All, and I mean all, especially children from poor and marginalized communities. And that must be used to improve learning and learning outcomes, which will then impact on performance on exams. And that link needs to be nailed. So a very clear misconception is within the teaching fraternity is that formative assessment is for teaching and it's not linked to testing results. And I want to argue that effective formative assessments will lead to improvements in learning, which will lead to improvements in exams. And so even within performativity systems where exams count, the use of formative assessment is going to make a difference. So what are my definitions of assessment of learning and for learning? Chair, how much time do I have? And I know what to skip and what to focus on. Can you give me some indication, Chair? Okay, so I have a definition of assessment of learning. I have a definition of summative assessment, and I'm not going to spend time on that. There's a very clear framework on how this process works. I have a definition of assessment for learning. The key point I want to make is that assessment for learning involves 2 processes. One, it's assessment used during the lesson, and 2, assessment used after the lesson. During the lesson is what we call formative, and evidence used after the lesson that you've tested is what we call formative use of summative results. Okay? So, and I'll give an example. So, for example, the other really critical point I want to make is that if you collect assessment evidence during your teaching, during your lessons, if you collect assessment evidence, whether verbally or through questioning or through marking, and you don't use that information, it's what I would call it's AWT. And AWT stands for Assessment for Wasting Time. And there's lots of evidence of teachers, lecturers collecting this information and not acting on it. And so the point there is assessment is only formative to the extent to which it leads to learning gains. So let me give a quick example and that will portray this point. And Chair, can you tell me how much time I have, please? Hello? Chairperson?
Yes. Yes, bro.
How much time do I have?
15 minutes.
15.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'll be done in 15 minutes. So let me give an example. Okay, so you are making soup, right? And everybody knows the process of making soup. It's not a gendered process. So the minute after you're making the soup, the minute you serve the soup and your family taste it, that is what's called summative assessment, okay? And your family or your friends, etc., tells you the salt is not enough, or the carrots are too hard, or the soup was really nice and very tasty. That is responses, what we would call summative assessment. Point number 2, while you're busy making soup and you taste it, and if you realize that the salt is lacking or the vegetables are too hard, and you act on this information, before you serve the soup. So you add more salt or you let the vegetables cook for a little longer. That is formative assessment, okay? But if you don't use it, so if you're making the soup and you taste it and you say, there's not enough salt, but I don't have time to add salt, or the salt is finished, or I don't have time to cook it longer, that is not formative. That's what we would call assessment for wasting time. Now, here's where the complication and the confusion comes a lot is, after you serve the soup and you got feedback, okay? And the next time you make the soup and you use the information, so when your family told you about the soup, there wasn't enough salt, or the carrots are not cooked, and so the next time you make soup, and use this is what we would call the formative use of summative assessment results. And so it's critical that you know this distinction, because it impacts on how you use it and where you use it. And if you want a very easy definition and distinction between formative and summative, formative means only measuring and monitoring the plant. It won't grow. Only using formative, it doesn't grow. Summative. Formative means watering and feeding the plant. It directly affects growth. And as you can see, that watering that plant is growing. And so the same analogy in the schooling system, in your lecture theaters, you need formative assessment to give feedback. You need formative assessment to identify the learning gaps and address it. If you identify and don't address it, it's a waste of time. And so here's a framework. And so this slide is quite important because it tells you which aspect of the system you function in and whether you can use formative, summative, or formative use of summative information. So for example, policymakers, district officials primarily use summative assessment. Actually, they use summative, they only engage in summative assessment. Teachers, learners, students, lecturers use both summative, formative, and formative use of summative. Whereas national officials, union officials, the ANA results or the TIMS results only have access to summative, and use it in a formative manner if they use it. So this is an example of how it impacts on your classroom or your lecture practices, and I will skip that for now, okay? I'm kind of rushing for time. I'm going to leave this Asina discipline principle out, besides to say that your evidence must be based on local context, and it's absolutely critical that you use local evidence. And so, for example, this is a randomized controlled trial we conducted to determine what is the impact of the assessment for learning strategy on teachers. And as you see in this cell, that even teachers, okay, teachers from no-fee schools who participated in the program, their levels of knowledge, skills were significantly higher than teachers from fee-paying schools who did not participate. And so it was critical, the evidence to say that one, this intervention works, and most important from an equity perspective, from a social justice perspective, does it work for teachers serving learners from poor marginal communities? And it was quite clear it does. The other really important part is for evidence is learners. It is really, really important to get evidence from our learners. As you can see, learners that were in schools with the green, in almost all cases, are saying that the teacher actually used those strategies and techniques, and they actually like some of those things, and it made a difference. So it was important to get evidence from children as well. Now, the each one teach one principle, it talks to an intervention model, and I'm not going to say much about it. I've got 9 minutes. But the key point about this model, and maybe I should say for teachers, is that capacity development using Cascade doesn't work. We know that for 30 years, we've tried it and it's not working. We need a new way of engaging our teachers, of our lecturers. We need a new way of ensuring the agency of teachers, the teacher knowledge, the teacher skills are centralized in professional development program. And so this is what we call the REMAPS model, where you begin professional development activities by reflecting on prior knowledge and experience of teachers. You mediate new knowledge and skills. You support teachers or participants to acquire and adapt, and this applies to subject advisors as well. You work on planning and preparing for lessons, on how to present it. All of this is underpinned by support, professional learning communities, each other, and facilitators. And here's the key. You go back to the classroom after the workshop. And unlike previous training, etc., you come back to the workshop to report, but Prof, we tried this out, it's a waste of time, it doesn't work in our schools. Or we tried this out, it needs to be adapted. Or we tried this out and it works. And this cyclical process continues until you develop the requisite knowledges or skills. The second component, colleagues, about this cascade model is that one, you don't just give training and leave your lead teachers or your subject advisors or even your teachers. You need to provide support to develop the new skills. You need to provide support then to implement the skills, and you need to provide support to support the use of the skills, and eventually move into a way where the skills that you develop as lecturers or NGO specialists is integrated into the system and they don't need you anymore. I need to train and have programs where in few years' time I am no longer needed because the system must develop, it's sustained. And the last point is to say we have a program for ministry officials to improve their assessment literacy. So, Chair, we also have a number of local material developed by South Africans, for South Africans, with input by South African teachers, where this, on the left-hand side, there's a program for teachers and subject advisors. The middle is a program for school leaders. And on the side, there's a program for policymakers, because if you want effective intervention and to bring about change, you need to have a common understanding across the system. And this is, it's a new form that has practice, practice, theory, etc., etc. Chair, I'm on my last set of slides, and here I want to argue the principle called reporting as recipes. And by that I mean reporting to promote actionable next steps. Any feedback you give to children, any feedback you give to your students, if it doesn't lead to action, it's a waste of time. So when you give a tick or a cross, Yes, your district might need it, but as far as learning is concerned, as far as the child is concerned, I either got it right or wrong, but how is it going to help me learn? How is it going to help me improve learning? How is it going to help me improve teaching? So, the key problem I want to argue is that the current reporting framework is problematic. It needs to be changed. What we need instead is a format which is based on recognize the development level of children. It is based on a constructive way of learning and recognize that learners are functioning at different levels or across different subjects, if you can see. And it tells you what learners know and can do. So here's an example, okay? Let's say level 1. The definition, and this is the program we use at TUT when we train our teachers in assessment. So if I say my students is at level 1, it means this teacher is at the beginning stage of learning the theory and demonstrate very limited knowledge and understanding of the strategies. And it means that the teacher will struggle to use this in the classroom and will struggle to identify learners. So it does mean that this teacher, student teacher now needs to go and improve his or her understanding, and we support them in doing that. Okay, so so can you see, if you look at the slide here, there's no marks. It's information that leads to action. So it tells you, for example, let's say at level 3 implications for classroom practice. It says the teacher can integrate the formative assessment into their practices, but this teacher is not very effective in supporting all learners to address the gap, and they'll only have some practice in using reflection. So it's quite clear that this teacher must work on how to reflect to improve their practice, and it's quite clear that this teacher needs more support in how to support learners, and that's the gap he or she needs to work on. So this is what we're calling for, a different way and mode of reporting. Okay. So again, I'll skip this because this is how we report, and we provide these type of reports to our students. The other very critical point is it also has an equity focus, because we're arguing that the number of learners at the evolving level, if you can see the graph on the side, by the year 2025, that number must go down. So you can see that maybe now we have large number of learners in the red, but moving forward, those learners must move to improve their knowledges and skills. And it has nothing to do with scores, but more on learning. Okay, Chair, let me take literally 2 minutes before I conclude about talking about this huge elephant in the room that's going to impact literally everything. And that also has some serious colonial background sensitivities to take into account. And there's 3 issues I want to talk about. The one is what I want to say is there's no question that AI is going to impact learning, teaching, and assessment. And there's certainly no question that AI has benefits. But the one point that I think is critical for us to take into account is the fact that there are some serious issues that are still unknown with AI. And the first one is what I would call cognitive atrophy. In other words, the impact on using AI has demonstrated to have reduced cognitive development that has a negative impact on improving thinking, on improving critical skills. And the current research from a number of institutions, including MIT, shows that used uncritically, AI is actually a bad thing for learners. They're not learning. They might be doing well, they might be submitting lovely assignments, but there's decline in cognition, decline in critical thinking, decline in effective engagement. So that's the one thing. The second point here is reducing diversity. The fact that AI models, AI systems are primarily, actually almost exclusively controlled and dominated and run from the West means that the voices and the knowledges that are promoted across AI systems come from a specific population group or comes a specific group of people, mainly from upper and middle class individuals in the West. And what it does is that the voices of poor and marginalized communities, the voices of countries and people that don't have access to the resources to impact on this are reduced. And thus, there's a diversity impact. It reduces diversity and agency across it. And it's getting worse because what AI systems are doing now is they're learning from the very same knowledge that the AI has generated. And so further reducing diversity, because now the new knowledge they're giving you is based on what AI has created rather than humans or new research. And the last point about the negative impact of AI is this digital poverty, that the fact that marginalized communities that have limited access cannot address that. So with that said, the last slide I'm going to talk about is the next steps. And just to say that there's 3 next steps. The key point is to improve the policies, to improve reporting and dissemination. And the one good news, we can say that at TUT, we've actually offering from next year a master's and doctoral program to build expertise in assessment, measurement, learning, and the use of technologies, improving learning. And lastly, to upscale with the support of unions and the ministry, the assessment for learning, professional development programs that are targeted for subject advisors, school leaders, teachers, and policymakers. And we also have a similar program for lecturing staff that we've also implemented. And with that, Chair, I want to thank you, colleagues, your time, for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions, suggestions, and comments, Chair. Thank you.
Huh? It's off.
But announce for gala dinner, they can pay until 1 o'clock. Those who like to attend the gala dinner, and there are artists.
Okay. Can you announce that there? Colleagues, thank you very much for attending this presentation. I have a few announcements to make. The first one is that we are going to have a presentation here in Turo Hall at 3 o'clock. And the title of the presentation here is From Systematic Evaluation to Effective Classroom Practice. And the presenter is Philip Dichom. You may find that this presentation was not on the program. So please take note of this additional presentation, which is going to be in here in Turo Hall at 3 o'clock. My second presentation announcement is that for those who still want to pay for the gala dinner, the secretary is still open or until 1 o'clock. So you can pay until 1 o'clock for the gala dinner. We are also going to have musicians from around Limpopo. They are going to announce them, and maybe around 1 o'clock we have an idea of who is invited and who is not invited. Thank you very much. Please note that from here, can we move, look at the program. We are not going for tea, but we are going for parallel sessions in various halls. So let's look at the program carefully so that we don't grab cups of tea as we pass through the passages and corridors. Thank you very much.